All right, so today we're going to dive into something, well, it's pretty heavy, I guess you could say. Caste systems.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
you heard that right. Caste systems in America. Ever think of the U.S. having something like the caste system in India?
Right.
It's kind of wild, right? But that's what we're going to be exploring today, based on Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. Before we get too far into it, though, I want to say up front that this is a really complex and sensitive topic, and we are not here to tell you what to think, but rather to unpack Wilkerson's ideas and see how they resonate. So buckle up, we're about to take a deep dive
Yeah.
into how Wilkerson sees caste playing out right here in the good old U.S. of A.
What I find so fascinating is that Wilkerson doesn't start with America. She takes us straight to India, to the source, to really understand. Their ancient caste system. You've got this incredibly rigid hierarchy.
Right.
Brahmins, the priests and scholars, are at the top. Then the Kshatriyas, the warriors and rulers. Followed by the Vaisyas, the merchants and farmers. Then the Shudras, the laborers. And at the very bottom, the Dalits, who were considered so low they were called untouchables.
It's hard to even fathom that level of social stratification. You're born into your caste and that's it, right?
Yeah.
No upward mobility,
Yep.
no matter what you achieve in life.
It's truly mind-boggling. To illustrate just how deeply ingrained this hierarchy is, Wilkerson shares this pretty chilling anecdote. Imagine a Dalit having to crawl on the ground so that their shadow doesn't touch a Brahmin.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the reality of the Indian caste system.
That image is just stuck with me now. But okay, so I get that we're setting the stage here, but how does this ancient system in India connect to the United States?
Right. That's where Wilkerson's argument gets really interesting. She's saying that the U.S. has its own version of a caste system,
Right.
built around race. Now, it's obviously not as rigid or overt as the Indian system, but the underlying principle, she argues, is the same, a fixed hierarchy that impacts every aspect of life.
So to be clear, she's defining caste as any system that establishes a hierarchy of human value, determining who gets respect, resources, and opportunities. And she's saying that race in America functions in a similar way to these strict Indian castes.
Exactly. And to make it even more concrete, Wilkerson lays out this hierarchy in America with white Americans at the top, African Americans at the bottom, and Asian and Latino Americans somewhere in the middle. It's this framework, this unseen structure that she believes has shaped and continues to shape American society.
Okay. I'm starting to see the connection here, but where did this whole American caste system come from? It's not like it was written into the Constitution or anything, right?
Right. Wilkerson traces it all the way back to 1619, the year the first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia.
Ah, yes.
The beginning of slavery in America, an incredibly dark chapter in our history.
Perk and pivotal to the formation of this caste system, according to Wilkerson. The colonists needed labor to build their new world, and they saw enslaved Africans as the answer. Wilkerson points out this cruel irony. They were seen as valuable for their strength, their agricultural skills, their immunity to European diseases, all these positive attributes twisted to justify their enslavement.
So the need for cheap, exploitable labor fueled the creation of this racial hierarchy.
Okay.
It's almost like they needed a system to dehumanize these individuals in order to justify the horrific conditions they were subjected to.
Precisely. And we're not just talking about hard work here. The conditions were truly horrific. Wilkerson details the absolute brutality of slavery. People treated as property, bought and sold, families torn apart, subject to unimaginable violence.
It's hard to even comprehend the level of suffering they endured. It's heartbreaking. Wilkerson gives this example. In South Carolina, enslaved people were forced to work 14 to 15-hour days, often on meager rations, like a peck of corn a week.
A peck of corn? Seriously? That's barely enough to survive on. And this was their reality, day in and day out. It's just unfathomable.
It is. And here's the thing that really gets me. Even though slavery was abolished in 1865, Wilkerson argues that the caste system didn't just disappear. It morphed, adapted.
Yeah.
But that core hierarchy, that sense of inherent superiority and inferiority based on race, remained woven into the fabric of American society.
Okay. So if slavery is gone, how is this caste system still operating? What are the mechanisms that keep it alive, even today?
Wilkerson identifies what she calls the 8 pillars that uphold the caste system. And while all 8 are important, there are a couple that really highlight how this system sustains itself, even today. Let's start with endogamy and the purity of the dominant caste. It's a mouthful, but it basically means marrying within your own caste. This is huge in maintaining the so-called purity of the dominant white caste.
So it wasn't just about laws and policies, it was about social norms, about controlling who people could form relationships with. And this idea of purity, it's just so disturbing.
Yeah.
It's like they were trying to create this artificial hierarchy
Yeah.
based on something as arbitrary as skin color.
Exactly. This need for separation, for maintaining the purity of the dominant group, is a key factor in how this caste system perpetuates itself.
And this wasn't just a historical phenomenon, right? You're saying this idea of endogamy still plays a role in how things operate today.
Absolutely. It's less overt, of course.
Hmm.
But the underlying social pressures, the unspoken rules about who is acceptable to date, to marry, to form families with, they're still there. We see it in the way certain communities are segregated, in the disparities in interracial marriage rates, even in the subtle ways people are treated differently based on who they choose to be with. It's like this echo of the past that continues to resonate in the present.
It's like this undercurrent that we might not even be aware of, but it's shaping our choices, our relationships, our entire social fabric. It's unsettling, to say the least.
It is. And to really drive home how this system sustains itself, let's look at another one of Wilkerson's pillars, occupational hierarchy. Basically, certain jobs were, and in many ways still are, reserved for certain castes.
So even if you were talented or hardworking, your caste could dictate what you could achieve professionally. It's like a system designed to keep people trapped in predetermined roles based on their perceived social standing.
You got it. And this isn't just about individual ambition. It's about access to opportunities, to resources, to networks that can help people advance in their careers. We see it in the disparities in income, in wealth, in representation across different industries. It's like this invisible hand that guides people towards certain paths based on their caste.
This is all starting to feel pretty heavy, to be honest. But I think it's important to acknowledge this history, to understand the mechanisms that have shaped our society.
Yeah.
If we want to move towards a more equitable future, we need to confront these uncomfortable truths about our past.
I completely agree. And while it's easy to get bogged down, in the historical context, I think it's crucial to examine how these pillars, these deeply ingrained beliefs and practices, continue to impact us today.
That's a great point. So let's shift gears and dive into the present. How does this caste system manifest itself? In modern America, it's not like we have whites-only signs anymore.
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? Has America truly moved beyond this deeply ingrained caste system? Wilkerson argues that while it's become less overt, less in your face, the underlying structure still impacts our society in profound ways.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's unpack that in part two. So we've established that this caste system, while less overt than in the past, is still very much present in modern America. But how do we actually see it play out? It's not like people are walking around with caste labels on their forehead.
Right, it's become much more subtle, almost insidious. But that doesn't make it any less real or impactful. Wilkerson uses these really powerful anecdotes in her book that, at first glance, might seem small or insignificant, but they reveal so much about how caste operates beneath the surface.
You mean example, what kind of anecdotes are we talking about?
She talks about this. Successful black woman who goes to visit a friend in a wealthy, predominantly white neighborhood. As she's knocking on the door, a white neighbor assumes she's the dry cleaner and tries to hand her clothes.
Oh, wow. It's funny because when you first start describing the scene, it sounds so innocuous, but then bam, that twist. It's like a punch to the gut. It's a stark reminder that no matter how accomplished she is, she's instantly reduced to a stereotype based on her race.
Exactly. And the thing is, this isn't just some isolated incident. Wilkerson shares another story about a black man who's a guest at a fancy party. He's well-dressed, accomplished, but a white guest mistakes him for a waiter and asks him to fetch a drink.
It's like these constant little reminders, these microaggressions that reinforce this underlying caste system, even if you've achieved success, even if you're in spaces that are supposed to be inclusive, your caste can still precede you.
It's almost like you can't escape the shadow of this hierarchy. And sometimes the consequences can be even more serious. Wilkerson talks about a black actor who won an Academy Award, yet he's still accused of shoplifting at a high-end deli simply because of his race.
It's almost like these unconscious biases are baked into our social fabric. We see it in the news all the time. Black people being unfairly targeted by law enforcement, being followed in stores, being treated with suspicion simply because of their race.
And that's exactly what Wilkerson is getting at. These examples, she argues, are not just isolated incidents. They're symptoms of a deeper societal structure that continues to privilege some and disadvantage others based on their perceived caste. It's like this invisible script that's playing out over and over again.
Okay, so We've seen how this caste system manifests in everyday life. But what about the bigger picture? What are the long-term consequences of this system?
That's where it gets really heavy. Wilkerson argues that the caste system harms everyone, though in very different ways. For those at the bottom, it's been centuries of trauma, of being denied opportunities, of facing constant discrimination and violence.
It's like this collective wound that hasn't had a chance to heal, passed down through generations.
Exactly. And what's even more insidious is that Wilkerson talks about how the caste system can create internal divisions within communities of color.
You mentioned the term Stockholm Syndrome earlier. In the context of caste, that's a heavy term. Could you unpack that a bit more for me?
Sure. Stockholm Syndrome typically refers to a situation where hostages develop positive feelings towards their captors. Wilkerson uses it to describe how some people in lower castes internalize the values and expectations of the dominant caste. Even if it goes against their own interests, they might adopt the dominant group's standards of beauty, their ways of speaking, even their prejudices against their own group.
That's so fascinating and heartbreaking at the same time. It's like they're trying to survive within a system that's rigged against them, and sometimes that means adopting the very mindset that's used to oppress them.
Exactly. And then there's the constant pressure to code switch, to shrink yourself, to conform to the dominant caste's expectations in order to fit in. The emotional toll that takes on individuals is immense.
You know, this reminds me of something I saw on social media the other day. A video of a black man being followed around a store by security, even though he was clearly just shopping like everyone else. It's these everyday occurrences that really highlight how Wilkerson's ideas are still so relevant. We might not have explicit segregation anymore, but these subtle forms of discrimination persist.
It's like the caste system has gone underground, but it's still operating just below the surface, shaping our interactions, our perceptions, our opportunities.
But you said this system harms everyone, even those at the top. That might be a hard pill to swallow for some people. How does that work?
It's a good point. You see, Wilkerson argues that while the dominant caste might have access to more resources and opportunities, they also pay a price for this system.
Okay, I'm listening. What kind of price are we talking about?
Well, she argues that they lose out on empathy, on connection, on a truly accurate view of the world. They live in a bubble of privilege, shielded from the realities faced by those in lower castes. They might not see the systemic barriers, the everyday injustices, the ways in which the caste system is actively harming people.
So it's like they're trapped in their own way, blinded by their position in the hierarchy. They might think they're benefiting from this system, but they're also losing out on something fundamental, the ability to connect with others on a human level, understand the world beyond their own limited experience.
Exactly. And that blindness, that lack of empathy can be incredibly dangerous. It allows injustice to perpetuate. It fuels fear and division. And ultimately, it prevents us from creating a truly just and equitable society.
This is all a lot to take in. It feels like we've uncovered this deep, dark underbelly of American society. But I have to ask, where do we go from here?
Is there any hope for dismantling this system?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one we'll explore in part 3. So we've explored the history of America's caste system and how it continues to operate in these subtle but insidious ways. But now comes the big question. Where do we go from here? Is there hope for dismantling this deeply ingrained system?
You know, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, even hopeless, when you're confronted with the sheer scale and complexity of this issue.
Yeah.
But Wilkerson, despite painting this pretty bleak picture, she doesn't leave us without a sense of agency. She argues that understanding the caste system, truly seeing it for what it is the crucial first step towards dismantling it.
So knowledge is power. But how do we move from awareness to action? What can we actually do to challenge this system that seems so embedded in our society?
Well, Wilkerson offers a few really insightful ideas. She suggests that recognizing the ways in which we all participate in this system, consciously or unconsciously, is crucial. We need to start by examining our own beliefs, our own behaviors, and how they might be perpetuating this hierarchy.
It's like taking a long, hard look in the mirror and asking ourselves, am I part of the problem? Which can be uncomfortable, right? To acknowledge our own biases, our own complicity in a system that harms others.
It can be incredibly challenging, but it's also essential. It's about becoming aware of those automatic assumptions, those ingrained biases that we might not even realize we hold.
You know, this reminds me of a story Wilkerson shares in the book. She talks about being in a store when a white woman, clearly flustered, comes up to her and starts asking for help, Wilkerson, thinking she's just another customer, tries to direct her to a staff member.
Ah, yes. But there's a twist, isn't there?
Oh, there's a twist, all right. The woman gets even more agitated and says, "No, I need you to help me. You people are always in the back doing the cleaning," it turns out. She assumed Wilkerson was a store employee simply because of her race.
That's such a powerful example
Mm.
of how these unconscious biases play out in everyday life. It's those automatic assumptions, those ingrained beliefs that can be so insidious.
And what makes the story even more powerful is Wilkerson's response. She talks about how in that moment, she had a choice. She could have reacted with anger, with resentment, which would have been totally understandable. But instead, she takes a deep breath and says, "Ma'am, I don't work here."
Wow, what a perfect illustration of how to disrupt the system. Not by fighting fire with fire, but by calmly asserting her own humanity, her own right to be seen as an individual, not a stereotype.
Exactly. And it's these small acts of resistance multiplied over and over again that Wilkerson believes can start to chip away at the caste system. It's not about waiting for some grand revolution. It's about changing the way we think, the way we interact, the choices we make every single day.
Yeah, it's about challenging those assumptions, calling out those microaggressions, refusing to be complicit in a system that dehumanizes others. And it's also about having empathy, about listening to the experiences of those who are harmed by this system, about amplifying their voices.
It feels empowering, actually. Like each of us has the power to make a difference, to contribute to creating a more just and equitable world. But it's also a huge responsibility, isn't it?
It is. And it's not easy. Unlearning centuries of ingrained bias takes work, it takes honesty, and it takes a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our society. But it's a journey worth taking.
So what's the takeaway for our listener today? What can they do to start dismantling this caste system in their own lives?
I think the most important thing is to open your eyes, pay attention, and then choose to act. Start by examining your own beliefs and behaviors. Where do you see traces of the caste system playing out in your life, in your community? Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you see it, you have a responsibility to do something about it.
It's like Wilkerson is handing us a mirror and saying, "Look closely. What role are you playing in this story?" That's a powerful challenge to leave our listeners with today.
Absolutely. And if you're ready to dive deeper into this topic, I highly recommend checking out Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents. It's a challenging read, but an incredibly rewarding one.
Well said. And on that note, we're wrapping up this deep dive. Hopefully it sparked some new insights and maybe even inspired some action. Remember, dismantling this system requires all of us to be aware, to be engaged, and to be willing to challenge the status quo. So keep those conversations going, folks. Keep learning and keep pushing for a more just and equitable world.